Chapter 9, Penchant Thoughts Saul Dugress. Your Majesty, my apologies, but Lady Saul insists on seeing you, Dogan said. He glanced at Lamare and then back to Wind as though my visit was an intrusion. It was hard to stay angry when one's power was calmness. I could make people calm by touching them, saying soothing words, or merely looking at them. Earlier, Dogan would not move from his post even after I told him that Wind and I had an appointment today. But when I started using my power on him, Dogan's arguments were replaced by a welcoming attitude, and he even presented me to Wind immediately. Surely, he was learning proper behavior. Let her in, Dogan. See Lamare out. Wind's voice sounded like steel. Lamare stood up. Wind, Your Highness, another fortnight? She asked. And I hated her for calling the Emperor by his first name. It broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Why did he let a lowly scribe call him Wind? It was a mystery I could never figure out. Wind's eyebrows shot up. As part of the agreement. Why? Your Grace, I request a full month to come up with something more. She paused as though searching for the right word, creative. Besides, the trips to the palace are long, and I get tired easily. The brown-haired girl with her matching brown eyes must have sprouted courage overnight, but there was a slight tension on her shoulders, as though she was afraid of what Wind would say, but knew all too well nonetheless that she had to try. No, a fortnight just like what we agreed upon, or I'll take it that you no longer agree to your part of the bargain, Wind shot back. I wondered for the 100th time what this agreement could be. Whenever I asked Wind, he said that it was of great importance to the future of Akea, but never has he shared what it was with me. Lamare's mouth opened in protest. Her throat moved as she swallowed air, but instead of a retort, she nodded curtly before turning away. Her behavior was a mystery as well. She may be the royal scribe, but to me, she was still an ordinary Akeen, and yet, sometimes, her actions seemed more appropriate for someone who could rule Akea. There was something regal about her demeanor which I found highly odd for a commoner. Dogan followed her out, and the pair made an unusual sight. Such a big ugly man is escorting a pristine, beautiful woman, a lady in rags and a beast in armor. If I had not been feeling so calm, I would have laughed. Saul, I don't have time for you. I spent half a day going over the future of Akea, Wind said. His voice was soft, a bare whisper. He was dismissing me already. The steely note to his voice was gone by now. I was unsure if it were my power or if he still remembered some of the tenderness he had for me in the past, before ambition conquered his mind. Before he rose to power. Before all of this. I've only just arrived, and here you are already closing your doors on me? I made my voice falter because I knew the breaks in my voice stirred something in his chest. He had never wanted to hurt me. He went back to his throne and sat, eyes calculating. You and I, it is no more, Saul, he said coldly. I'm not here to reminisce about the past, but as I have pledged my services to the Emperor of Akea, I'm here to serve, Your Grace. I have whores. I don't need affection. The steel in his tone was back. I closed my eyes to remain calm. To not argue with him, to not fight. Because I couldn't make him see sense anymore. He had become a different person from the Wind I used to know. He used to stand for what he believed in. He used to fight for his rights, but as soon as he held power, everything that he once stood for vanished, including any fondness he had left for me. Wind once said that he wanted me beside him because he needed me. That when everything in his person was in turmoil, I was the only one who could make his heart grow still, helping him remember the quiet moments and those days of happiness that we shared. And because I loved him, I stayed. I had not realized how far he had run away from me, but it was a distance that could not be bridged by being with him for a few hours in a week. Sometimes, I wish that Wind had not become emperor. It sounds selfish, but I sometimes catch myself wanting things to go back to the way they were before. Wind had only told me that Northson was gone, but nobody knew how he died. Wind told me it was fate that he became emperor. He never told me anything more. He has a dozen moods, and there were times that he could be cruel, but I never believed him to be a murderer. The conundrum still hung in the air, though. How did Northson die? Where was his body? The former emperor was not unwell, and there had been no open opposition to his reign. Rumors spread in the palace that it was Wind who killed Northson, but I discredited it. Wind may be mayhem itself, but his heart was still intact. I told myself this every day. A moon turn after Northam had vanished, Lamare started coming to the palace to meet with Wind. Each time, she presented him with a scroll. As royal scribe, I expected her to join in palace meetings, but she was never an attendee. Neither did she write down any directives, or new policies, or new rules. Instead, every fortnight, she and Wind met with Dogan, who guarded the entrance. No one was permitted to enter the chambers while they were in discussion. The scrolls held all the answers, I was sure of it. I looked at the ashes that gathered near the foot of the throne. There were no more traces of what had been written on them. Someday I'll get a hold of a scroll, I told myself. A man needs love. That was all I could say, and it seemed to connect to the old Wind I knew. He blinked, and his face lost the hostility it held earlier. Stay with me tonight. I was surprised, but it was what I wanted to hear. Without much thought, I replied, as I vowed a long time ago. I walked towards him and knelt when only a few feet separated me from the throne. He rose and took my hand. He kissed me, and I got lost in the kiss that brought him back to me. I hoped that the calmness would chase away his darkness, and he would always find his place with me. I remember the day Wind found his father drunk, sobbing over Marcella's loss. She had not died, but somehow I wished that she did because it was more painful to be left behind for no reason at all. Wind told me that he was only 8 when his mother went away, and deep down, I knew that she was not coming back. More than likely, her life had moved on without both of them. Urging Marcella to return to their lives might have been as futile as a carpenter's attempt to build a house with just one nail. That was one of the times I saw Wind seething. The first was when the wine lord had slapped his father. The second was when his father was drunk and sobbing like a child, saying how Marcella would never return to their cottage in Minoan. Perhaps in frustration, Wind shouted at the grape pickers. It was odd because Wind had always respected the lower ranks since he was also one of them not so long ago. Sometimes, I feared that the storm inside of him would spin out of control. But I always convinced myself that with me by his side to balance out his storms, he could be appeased. Wind was sitting in front of the cottage, his face unreadable. He had just come back from plucking some grapes with his father. He was only 16 moon turns then, 4 moons younger than I was. Slowly, I moved to where he was, and he acknowledged my presence by resting his forehead against my shoulder after I sat down beside him. His tensed muscles relaxed. Wind's gray hair was cut quite short, and it made him look like he belonged in the sky with Luna and Risa. He seemed to be one with the clouds. He exhaled, and my heart went out to him. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I feel better now." He looked at me. "If I didn't have you beside me, I think I would have exploded by now." "I'm here. I'll always be here for you." He looked away and picked up a stone in front of him, pulling his arm back before throwing the stone away. "I'll go to Marcella. I think I can give Papa anything he wants." It dawned on me that crafting storms is such a potent power. There are no limits. I can command the air, water, fire, in a way, through lightning. And if I think about it, my power befits a leader. An emperor. I froze. I had never heard him talk that way before. At least not about being an emperor. Marcella is nobly born. That makes me partly noble too. I can be an emperor. Your power has great potential. I agree. But think about it. Northam has an heir. A girl. Are we going to let a girl rule Akea? She will be wed when the right time comes. The emperor will find her a suitable partner. It has always been like that, a partnership with one of the strongest houses. Wind kept still. Perhaps he was considering what I said. Northam's daughter had only seen one turning of the moon. It will still be a long way before she becomes ready to marry. Wind's jaw was set in determination, and I could not read what he must have been thinking. The notion of being an emperor might have gnawed at him. "What do you plan on doing with your mother?" I asked. "I'll go to Amare. If I have to beg Marcella to come home with me, I will." His eyes were again veiled with a tinge of anger or maybe a deep-rooted pain. Sometimes, it was impossible to read him. I squeezed his hand, willing him to settle down with his emotions, passing some of the calmness that I was feeling onto him. It worked. His eyes returned to their former state, sad and wanting. He looked at me. "Will you go to Amare with me?" I should have said yes. I should have never let him out of my sight because I knew that his temper could so quickly consume him. Instead, I stared into his eyes, kissed him lightly on the lips, and passed on to him another surge of calmness, hoping that it would linger longer in his heart. Shaking my head, I said, "This is between you and your mother. I'm sure that when she sees you, her boy, her heart will yearn to be with you and your father." He smiled at me, and his gray eyes brightened. "You always know the right things to say." He caressed my cheek and pulled me closer. "Wait," he said, and then he stood up. I saw him leaning towards the rose bushes. He picked 3 flowers. He was smiling as he crouched in front of me. "Because you are special to me," he said, a rare smile painted on his lips. When the storm in his heart was not stirring, his words could bring me to a place where even my usual composed self was caught off guard. I smiled as I took the flowers and smelled them, only to remember a bit too late that I was allergic to them. Any type, any color, any beautiful flowering bud. I sneezed, and in seconds, my eyes watered. "Are you all right?" "I'm sorry," Wynne said. "I didn't know." I shook my head and stood up. "No, it's allergies." I knew what would happen next. How could I be so careless? Just because the flowers came from Wynne did not mean that it would spare me my usual reaction to these horrid living things. As soon as I stood up, my fear materialized. With watery eyes, I looked around, the surroundings barely registering to my eyesight. Nausea followed. Then I collapsed into Wynne's arms. I woke up in bed with a bad case of the flu that night. The room was dark, and the only source of light was a dimly lit lamp atop the bedside table. The window was open to let the breeze into my room. I found Wynne beside my bed. He smiled sheepishly as soon as our eyes locked. I was worried. "I didn't know you hated flowers so much," he said, reaching out to touch my red, swollen face. I lingered in his warm touch and closed my eyes for a while. "Not hate them," I said. "Hate them only when they come from me," he teased. I smiled at him to let him know that I was fine. "Here. I got you something else," he said, and handed me a bunch of leaves that were arranged haphazardly with some thin, pointed leaves protruding from what was made to look like a bouquet. I could not help myself but laugh, and soon, he joined in as well. Those were the better moments, the ones that hold a special place in my heart. If I had known that there would be so few of them, I would have prayed for time to freeze. But all that is in the past. I was left unawares that so soon, Wynne would lose his temper again, so much so that he allowed himself to ravish the entire province of Amer, his mother's home. My flu was gone the following day, and when I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror, the redness and swelling of my face had vanished. The bouquet of leaves Wynne gave me last night actually looked endearing as it stood on the bedside table. A note sat beside it, saying that he would be on his way to Amer to see his mother and that we would celebrate when he returned with his mother. He asked me to help organize a festivity on day 2 of his absence because he expected that they would be back by then. I asked Gorio, Wynne's father, to help me with the preparations. I never told him the reason behind the celebration, except that when his son returned, he would expect some sort of festivities for the household. His forehead creased, but he just nodded without asking me any more questions. It was different with Luca. He started by shouting and cursing me for taking him for a fool. When I handed him the number of barrels of wine that we would need for the event, he went ballistic. His eyes grew wider, if that was still possible, and every time he opened his mouth to yell, a good amount of saliva spurted out. He said that even if wind could make it rain before the moon's full turning, wind would not be able to replenish and age wine soon enough to pay for the laborers' wages. Of course, that was an exaggeration on his part, and I had been expecting that, so when he opened his foul mouth once again, I used my power to calm him down. He froze momentarily, closed his eyes, visibly shivered, and when he opened his eyes, it was as though he was seeing me for the first time that day. 100 barrels? Surely, wind will want more, he said. I suppressed a smile. 100 is enough. Before my power on him wore off, I asked him to sign the paper instructing the release of the 100 barrels of wine. On the second day of Wind's absence, everything was set. On the main table where I expected Wind would be seated, I had flowers arranged on top of the table. I decided that I would not join them there today so that the family could reunite and have some privacy. The reconciliation would make Wind so happy, and with no more hatred in his heart, he would finally be able to control his power more skillfully. There would be fewer reasons for him to be ill-tempered. He would become a better man. When evening came, and there was still no sign of wind, I asked a few of the laborers to help Gorio and me cover the table arrangements, leaving them in place so that at any time Wind and Marcella arrived, the area would be ready. Wind could cast bolts of lightning in the sky, which were suitable replacements for fireworks. I slept lightly that night, hoping that they would arrive soon. When I woke up the following day, the sky was still dark as the morning had yet to break from my room's window. But since sleep was proving elusive, I got up and waited for Wind and his mother outside the cottage. It was difficult to wait because there was no means for us to communicate. All I could do was sit outside the cabin and wait for their return. I saw some faint movements in the darkness, a silhouette of a man who seemed to be taking his time walking. When my eyes adjusted to the dimness of the surroundings, I recognized Elder Mayandilo. He was almost hunched as he walked, his hair ashen. I had never known anyone so well endowed with intelligence and understanding of the world, so much so that he could shake me in my shell of serenity. Elder Mayan was a member of the Elders Guild, an independent group of wise men and women supported by the Akeans for their wisdom, teachings, and practical approach to all sorts of issues. There were instances that people chose to seek their assistance instead of the palaces, and it was known all over the land that even the palace relied on the elders' guidance and teachings. "Elder Mayan," I said, bowing to show my respect. "Saul," he said. He gazed up at the dark sky and turned his head to the left as though trying to make out a noise. He closed his eyes and whispered something that was not in the native tongue. The words sounded garbled as wispy sounds escaped his mouth. It was eerie that he talked to no one and said things nobody understood. Why couldn't he contain his thoughts inside his head? When Elder Mayan opened his eyes, he looked at me, and it seemed as though he wanted to tell me something. There was a ladybug near his ear. It was completely still on his neck, so much so that I thought it was a tattoo. I reached out to swat it, but Elder Mayan's hand shot up. "The ladybug is a friend, Lady Saul." "My apologies, Elder Mayan." I retreated. "There is a storm in the northeast. I could not pinpoint it exactly, just that it's there, and I've been told that the water level is rising fast. It could be dangerous." My mouth hung open. "You never cease to amaze me, Elder Mayan, but with all due respect, how did you learn of this?" "I have sources. Friends." There was a pause when he said it. I sensed some hesitation in him. "Is Wind here?" he asked. My heart started beating rapidly, but calmness won over it. "No. Wind left 3 days ago, and he went," I paused. "To Amer. The province lay in the northeast of Akea." Elder Mayan watched my reaction, but I was impassive in an instant. "Such a coincidence, then. I thought I should tell you," he said. I watched as he started walking away. A bird flew and rested on his shoulder. I thought it would fly away again. Instead, another bird flew and perched on the other side of his shoulder. It was midday, and there was still no sign of wind. Gorio looked worried, but he did not speak about it with me. When we were alone, we talked very little. The only thing that connected us was our affection towards Wind, nothing else. I had never liked Gorio. Maybe it was because I despised how he sobbed like a child when he was drunk and that he was a constant source of Wind's worries. The moons paled, and darkness slowly spread across the sky. Still, there was no sign of Wind. Gorio pointed to the sky. "Saul, look up," he said. A cloud formation was moving across the horizon, splitting the sky and disturbing the other, softer cottony wisps of cloud scattered above. It stopped right above us, and after a brief pause, wantonly descended upon us. We ran to escape from whatever it was that swooped down. Then it crashed yards away from us. It was cloud-like, we thought, but when we moved closer and the fog had thinned, we saw Wind, feet apart, hunched, and with his head bowed down. "Wind!" I shouted, running towards him immediately. "No!" he shouted back. He threw lightning, and it struck a tree a few yards away from me. Gorio winced as if lightning had struck him. From a distance, I could feel Wind's emotions, his turmoil, and I summoned with all my strength to bring my power to its full extent, pushing my limits. I tried to touch him even from afar, through my mind and heart. I did, but when my power touched him, I recoiled. He was so angry that my heart instantly burned with the hurt he was feeling. "Everybody who crosses me shall suffer. Nobody deserves to do this to me. To Father. Nobody." Wind was enraged, so I did the next best thing, I sang. It was a melody, only tunes, no words. It seemed to work. Wind stopped shouting, and eventually, I was no longer afraid to approach him. Gloria was watching us, but I was already oblivious to my surroundings as I walked closer to Wind. I knelt and clutched his head onto my chest upon reaching him. "My dear Wind," I whispered softly to his ears. "What did you do?" He pulled away from me, only enough so that he could look me in the eye. His eyelids fluttered before they opened, and I saw the young man I loved, the one that was so vulnerable, whose passion was so strong it scared even me. Marcella wouldn't come home with me. I was standing at the gates of her palace, and she wouldn't let me in. I knocked on her gates, but the guards wouldn't even acknowledge me. So I made a scene outside. That was when she came down. He paused and swallowed. We had the same eyes. It was like looking in a mirror. But her eyes told me she didn't want me. She didn't even talk to me. As soon as her eyes met mine, she cringed visibly as if I were some sort of a horrible reminder of her past, and, Wind shuddered, his body breaking into spasms as I held him against me. She went back in. Not one word. Not one cratty word. "Hush," I said. "I'm with you now. It will be all right." That's when I lost it, Saul. I didn't mean to. But I lost it. I never knew how powerful I could be. But in a matter of minutes, I was throwing down lightning on the palace. The soldiers were scared, but there were so many of them. They overpowered me and pinned me to the ground. But I wasn't finished. I called storms. The heavens thundered, and rain fell in torrents. I was so angry that I didn't remember feeling any other emotion apart from my rage against my mother. Water rose. There was flooding in a mare, and I was floating in a cloud. When I looked down, I saw that the first floor of the palace was already submerged, and people from nearby houses were climbing onto their rooftops. I was cold from terror. It was the darkness that consumed me. I can't afford to lose it again like that, no matter how angry I get. "So many people, Saul, crying for help," he said, sobbing. I don't know how many people died. I did not dare to look back. I flew away from it all. I don't even know how I managed to come back here, he continued, his voice breaking. Even though my face had gone pale, I did not allow him to see how distraught I was. I closed my eyes and bit my lip. "My dear heart." I hummed, and he relaxed, hugging me. That was when I saw that his body was severely matted with blood. Wounds ripped his arms, chest, and back. "You're bleeding all over. I'll bring you to Amaya. She will know what to do with your wounds." "Saul, I hate myself for it." "Please, please," he had broken away from my embrace, and the veins on his arms protruded as he gripped me. "Please, Saul. Promise me. When you are with me, you can control me somehow. Pacify me. Please. Please promise me. Don't leave me, I need you. You are my only light." I brushed back his tousled hair and drew my hand down to caress his face. I should not have let him go to his mother alone. At that moment, I realized that I had to use my power on him each time to prevent him from falling into the darkness. That was when I made the ultimate vow. "I promise I will always stay with you." It was too great a promise, but it was one I was confident that I would never break. I helped him stand up. Amaya would need a lot of herbs and oils to heal him. The wounds were the least of my worries, though. Nordstrom. The palace guards. Marcella. They were my fears. The news would travel to the emperor's palace, especially since it was a royal family that had suffered such horrific violence. We only had a matter of days before Wind would have to face whatever punishment the Canellan palace would deem suitable. I wondered how in the world I would protect him. 100 barrels of wine. All lost in a festivity that never even happened? Luca bellowed from the front yard. I ran outside the cottage to get to where the commotion was coming from. "Luca, not now. Please." It was Wind's voice. "How dare you? That was more than your share of the vineyard's produce. And the agreement was you have a share for only a puny percentage. How in the world do you plan on giving back what actually belongs to me?" Luca was a few feet away from Wind, glaring at him like a madman. Wind was the exact opposite. He had his torso wrapped in bandages, and he was barefoot. His forehead was wrinkled, but he did not seem to be angry. At least not yet. What I found as a surprise was that Amaya, the healer, let Wind out in this condition. Luca, I'll talk to you about the barrels, I said. Luca turned to me, eyes squinting and almost shut, with drops of spittle spurting out in a trajectory that would have put a cannonball to shame. No. You trickster. You're the one who had me sign the release of 100 barrels. I will not have anything to do with you. He pointed an accusatory finger at me, but it did not stop me until I reached Wind's side and held his hand. I was surprised to find that he was still calm. Most of the barrels are still intact. I will return them to you. I'm certain I can give back more than half of them, I said. Your filthy hands touch my barrels. You may return them, but I will not cancel the debt, he said, leering at me. Next month, you will not have a share. Wind's hand clutched mine tighter. I accept, Wind said. Huh? Luca said. I said, I accept. It's only fair. I got more than my share this month, so next month there'll be none. Good. Good. But return the remaining barrels to the stockhouse. That will not happen. Since you will charge me for the entire withdrawal of barrels, I will not return what's left in my custody. But Saul agreed. I said no. Now, you will leave or... What? Are you going to strike a lightning bolt at me? You haven't changed at all. Do you think that wearing better clothes has put you on equal footing with me? You are mistaken, peasant. It doesn't. You are what you have always been, an insufferable ruffian. As though the insult was not enough, Luca went on laughing, clutching at his bulging stomach. He was no fun to watch. His laughter grew louder as he made a wheezing sound as though calling Wind a ruffian was such a laughing matter. I should have used my power on Luca instead. Wind's face had colored a deep red, and he was clutching my hand so tightly. It's not worth it. Please, I whispered to Wind. Wind's jawline was set hard as he glared at me. He ridiculed me. I won't let this pass. I embraced him and used all I had to make him calm. But it did not work in the way I had hoped. His anger diminished but not so much. Wind, please. What? Huh? Luca said. His face was now flushed from making fun of Wind. Then, with a leer on his plump face, he started walking away. A gust of wind caught Luca, and he went tumbling forward. He stood up, and blood trickled down the side of his face. His mouth was hanging open, and if his eyes could shoot out venom, we would have died on the spot. You will find your place once I tell the Emperor of this incident. I have had enough of your arrogance. He shouted as he started to brush off the dust from his tunic. Another gust of wind blew. It was harder this time, and Luca did another somersault. It seemed impossible that Luca's body could be carried by air. Wind did not stop hauling Luca. The wine lord cried when invisible whips started flogging his body. When his garments had been torn and blood covered his body, Wind used the air to carry Luca right in front of us. Ugly, red welts and gaping wounds covered the wine lord's body. Your life or the vineyard? Wind's voice was like hardened steel. You are a fool, Luca said, angry but shaken. Blood dripped from his chin down to the ground. Another whip of air struck him across his face this time, and he moaned in agony. You have no air. Should you die, I'll own this vineyard just the same, Wind said. It matters not if I kill you or spare you today. I'll still have the vineyard either way. The only difference is timing. Luca's lower lip trembled. His eyes were suddenly moist. Release me, he choked. Say it. Say that the vineyard is mine. Wind said. Luca belched blood and he gurgled. He coughed, and when he stopped, he slowly nodded. Yours, he barely whispered. My thoughts were only on Wind and Luca. I had not noticed the crowd that gathered around us, witnessing everything. Everyone. You have just heard that this man has surrendered to me today, his vineyard. I am now your wine lord. All of you will do as I say, Wind shouted. Gorio's mouth thinned as he watched his son. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. I embraced Wind tightly, my eyes were closed, and my arms tightened around him. Then I tried getting support from everyone around me, measuring their level of calmness, but all I felt in them was fear. Not one soul was able to lend me the serenity I sought. I closed my eyes tighter and mustered all of my strength to pull calmness into one space and shove it inside Wind's tortured soul. His body lost some of its tension. I touched his heart, the burning emotion inside, and doused the fire from within him. Something stung my back as though a whip had hit me. I flinched as the searing pain coursed along the wound on my back. Nobody was close enough to me to do that. I reached behind me and then brought my hand up in front of my face. I stared in horror at the thick red fluid that stained my fingers, my blood. Was this how we were going to survive? Would restraining wind each time he had an episode leave an ugly scar on my back? It was as though the anger inside him needed to free itself, and the only conduit who could provide an escape for it was my body. We all paid our dues, and maybe this was how I was intended to pay for mine, the price of love. I looked at Luca. He was hugging himself and letting out curses that he meant for no one to hear. Nobody dared tend to him. Everybody was afraid of Wind now. Amaya, please see that Master Luca gets the help he needs, I said. Wind stood up and walked away. I did not know where he was going, but at that moment, I did not bother to follow him at all. One scar for today was enough. I shook my head, realizing that it was not just my back that bled. So did my heart.